Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first Executive Insight on Leadership's webinar here for the year. This is a webinar series that will take place throughout 2019. We're certainly glad that you're joining us, and you are certainly welcome to join us throughout the entire webinar series. We'll have at least one webinar per month, and we will keep you all posted and apprised as to that schedule as we continue to go through the year. You can see some of the members of the lineup. We're starting today with Malcolm Harkins, and it's great to have Malcolm join us and to kick off 2019 for us. For those of you that have been through the Professional Development Academy, you're familiar with Malcolm. Malcolm has helped the Professional Development Academy immensely with providing his own thought leadership relative to our cybersecurity program as well as our high performance leadership program, and then also introducing us to a number of other chief information security officers, other executives that have provided their thought leadership into our programs as well. For those of you not familiar with Malcolm, as you can see here from the cover page, he is a Chief Security Officer, Chief Security and Trust Officer at Cylance organization. Within this role, he reports directly to Stuart McClure, the CEO of Cylance, and in that role, Malcolm is responsible for enabling business growth through trusted infrastructure, as well as overseeing systems within organizations and across ecosystems and businesses, as well as overseeing business processes for Cylance and their customers. He has direct organizational responsibility for information technology, for information risk, as well as security and privacy policy for Cylance. Malcolm is also responsible for peer outreach activities to drive improvement across the world in the understanding of cyber risk, as well as best practices to manage and mitigate those risks. Malcolm, in those roles and in reaching out, has worked with Congress, worked with not only government in terms of privacy policy, but also organizational structures as well, both here in the United States and around the globe. And previous to Cylance, Malcolm served as the Vice President and Chief Security and Privacy Officer at Intel Corporation. And so with that as a background, let me just also indicate that throughout this presentation, certainly Malcolm is going to provide us executive insights on leadership. And if at any time you have questions, feel free to use the chat box here in the WebEx feature, and we'll be monitoring that throughout this webinar, and we'll bring your questions to Malcolm. If you would like for us to unmute you and allow you to present the question directly to Malcolm, we certainly can do that as well. But if at any time, again, feel free to use the WebEx chat feature to provide us any questions that you would like for us to pass along to Malcolm. And Malcolm, it's always great to have you with us, and it's great to have you joining us to kick off 2019 webinar series. And we know that your second edition of Managing Risk and Information Security, Protect to Enable, is available, and we certainly use content from this book within our cybersecurity program at the Professional Development Academy. We certainly appreciate that and all of your previous work, Malcolm. And again, it's always great to have you join us. Good morning, Malcolm. I'm going to hand it over to you to walk us through this Executive Insight on Leadership webinar. Thanks, Malcolm.
Thanks, Tim. Excited to be here, and hopefully some of the perspective I'll share with folks is useful. And as you said, prior to Cylance, I was at Intel. So a little bit of an oddball because I've only worked for two companies in the past 27 plus years, Intel and then Cylance going on 4 years now. So again, a little bit different than I think a lot of security folks who've migrated from company to company. The other part for folks that don't know my background that provides probably some difference of perspective is the fact that I'm not a technologist, and I grew up on the business side of things, both at Intel and prior to that with undergraduate in economics and MBA in finance and accounting. So with that as background, why don't we just go ahead and jump into this, Tim, if you can advance to the next slide. Again, the question that I think we all need to ask is, what is leadership? Again, the Professional Development Academy is a leadership academy applied in the information risk and security space. But I think people struggle with the notion of leadership and they confuse it. And fortunately for me, I taught a variety of leadership as well as management courses when I was at Intel for employees. And I spent a lot of time contemplating this and trying to grow myself continuously in this space. That's also one of the reasons why I try and participate in the Professional Development Academy as frequent as I can, because it reinforces in me the traits, the characteristics, the capability that we sometimes get lazy on or forget about, or just even the exchanges and the feedback causes me to learn and grow from the students as well during the interaction. So, Kim, why don't you go on to the next slide, and we can talk about some of the differences, Tim. I think people, again, sometimes confuse managing with leading. On the left-hand side of this is what really management is about. You know, you're enforcing rules, monitoring people, delegating things, preventing negative outcomes, compliance to standards, controls. So when you think of this left side of things, that is typically the management task, the management skills and capabilities. But it also, surprisingly, is very similar to what we do day in and day out in our jobs in managing risk and managing security. So I think and I believe that we've had a leadership gap when it comes to the risk and security executives, primarily because their day-to-day job is about all those things on the left-hand side: managing risks, managing controls, and that's different than leading. And we've got to not only lead our teams, but we've got to lead our organizations more broadly, as well as lead the industry in terms of how to think about risk and security and controls and compliance activities. And leadership on this right-hand side, again, you're promoting values, you're inspiring people, you're focusing on the future. And so often in the risk situations, we're so narrowly tactically focused today on the risk that's biting us in the ass versus thinking out about what the opportunities technology has for us and how to manage and mitigate those risks further out into the future. Again, and it's about promoting positive outcomes. And positive outcomes are not necessarily just mitigating the risk, but thinking about, again, the hope and opportunity that technology can create for the world and how it can empower our organizations to do things. This quote here is from the book, The Leadership Challenge, and there's another one later in this deck as well. But when I've thought about this, and I think if we all self-reflect, whether it was in school, whether it's in a team and your church or whatever, the leaders who have the most influence are the leaders who are closest to us. The folks that understand who we are, they have a shared sense of purpose or passion. They're folks that we might, report to or, again, be coached by. But there's almost an emotional bond besides the proximity that allows them to influence us. And I believe that one of the ways that as leaders we have to do this is also through being vulnerable. We have to share our own idiosyncrasies. We have to share what's going on not only in our lives outside of work, but inside of work, so that we have an ability for people to understand who we are, and that vulnerability that we can demonstrate, again, allows a level of shared perspective. But that's something that's hard for a lot of security folks to do, because our job is to prevent vulnerability. And so I've found a lot of folks that have worked in my teams, a lot of peers, struggle with demonstrating a level of appropriate vulnerability in the workplace. And that's because we're so focused on managing and mitigating it. But at an individual level, at a human level, I think the way in which we can gain closeness and connectivity to the employees and to the broader organization is also demonstrating, to some extent, a level of vulnerability that might be different for each of us in terms of comfort level. But the more I've expressed myself, the more I've made myself vulnerable to not only peers, but to organizations, the easier it's been to have a good dialogue and to get, again, that extra level of influence across a team. These 3 laws of leadership I love because it relates to this last item. If you don't believe in the messenger, you won't believe the message. You can't believe in the messenger if you don't know what the messenger believes, and you can't be the messenger until you're clear on what you believe. And so, again, it's all about personal clarity. What do you believe? Why do you believe it? It's one of the reasons why I transmit it all the time, both internally and externally. I put myself out there sometimes to be criticized, critiqued. I might be wrong in some of my beliefs, but if I share them and I'm open to feedback, I'll learn from that and learn from others. But what I've found is I've stated strongly, particularly in the industry that we're in, and I'll share a little bit more about my beliefs on the industry as we get further into this, but the more I've shared those strongly and firmly, one of 2 things happen. Those that don't believe what I believe will generally engage me, and we can have a articulate, hopefully, and objective debate and discussion on items and calibrate. And it's okay to disagree. Even internally, disagreement doesn't equal disloyalty. But at least if you understand each person's perspective, you can figure out a path to resolve it, even if it's agreeing to disagree. But if people know what you believe, what I've found is people line up towards the belief structure that is consistent. And so you can, again, kind of segregate out and get more people aligned with you if you're willing to transmit what you believe and why you believe it. Again, you'll find as we go through this, or if anybody's read my books or heard me talk before, I love quotes, and this one from Dennis Waitley I like. Again, we have two choices: accept things as they are, or accept the responsibility to change them. And again, when you apply that to the security industry itself, I honestly think that the security industry has failed us. And so one of the things that I've always tried to do is accept that responsibility to change and try and change the industry itself, try and change my approach to controls, try and do things differently so that we can get out of the spiral of risk we've been seeing for decades, rather than just accept it as it is and accept the risks will always be there. Again, I'm not, Pollyannish in the belief that we can eliminate risk, because we can't eliminate it physically, logically. Heck, you can't even eliminate it really financially. So you can't get it to zero, but there are things that we can do to dramatically change the way in which we manage and mitigate risks and make that situation better, not only for our company, our employees, our shareholders, but also society more broadly. If you go on to the next slide, Tim. Yeah, and this is one of the things that drives me nuts about the industry, drives me nuts about many of my peers and many security professionals that I've run into, is they have this notion that compromise is inevitable. And again, agreeing you can't eliminate risk, but I think if you start from the basis of I'm going to fail and I'm going to get owned and malicious code is going to get into my environment and people are going to steal intellectual property and I'm going to have all these insider risks and everything else, if you start from the basis of defeat, then you're never going to strive for your best situation to manage and mitigate the risk. Now, I believe that the attempt to compromise is inevitable, but I don't believe we have to, in essence, give up and give in and kind of roll over and capitulate to the equivalent of digital assault on our organizations, on our employees, on our customers. And so for me, that's a very strong belief that I have. recognizing the vast majority of the industry just accepts it and assumes that people are going to get in. Now, I think the reason why people have gotten to that state of, in essence, accepting compromise is, frankly, our current state of controls in most organizations are crap. You know, they are not designed strong enough to properly mitigate and manage the risks. It's too easy to get past most of the controls that are deployed in our organizations, and it's too easy for even nation-state actors. They don't have to, by and large, do dramatic things like we all talk about. And again, I find it funny every time there's a breach. You know, the headline article, "Sophisticated Actor." Well, it's not so sophisticated to get somebody to click on shit and then own their system because of the sloppy controls that we've got deployed. And again, we also haven't done a good job of holding the industry itself accountable and to some extent culpable for the technology not working to properly manage and mitigate the risks. Go on to the next slide, Tim. Again, I've mentioned this, the attempt to compromise is inevitable. Again, that will always be true, but we don't have to start from the basis of the assumption that they will always get in. Now, again, since you can't eliminate risk, we do have to recognize that risk may manifest itself and have the appropriate detection and response capabilities in place to manage and mitigate it once that occurs. But I think with a stronger control mindset, we can drain the swamp of a lot of the risks that we've been seeing across organizations. When I wrote my second book, which was published a little over 2.5 years ago now, I had kind of stepped back because I was tired of what I'd say the marketing manipulations on the industry, on our executives, on our CIOs, heck, even on us, that was confusing the notion of controls. You'd have the detection and response industry saying, hey, they're just going to get in. We've just got to find them faster and respond better. And you'd have the prevention side of the industry saying detection and compromise are a lie, you shouldn't believe it, you can do better. The reality is we need all sorts of controls. And so what I tried to do was up-level this into a framework that we'll go through here on the next couple slides to what I'd say create a control philosophy and a consistent language that helps people understand what these controls are good for and are not good for. And I think we all know there's 3 primary ways you can control for risk: prevention, detection, and response. Now, as you go from prevention to response in those control types, risk grows. It doesn't matter if it's physically, logically. And then there's 3 primary approaches: automated, semi-automated, and manual. And as you go from automated to manual, cost grows. Now, what the industry has done is confuse all these things as well as confuse what these controls are good for or not good for. Prevention is focusing on minimizing vulnerability and potential for harm. Detection and response are damage minimization controls, because when you're detecting and responding, bad things are already starting to occur. And so the only real variables you can play with there are time to detect and time to contain. And so, again, when we start teasing out these things, this is a framework, like I said, that I put together a couple of years ago. And I've used it internally. I've had peers and others in the industry who've used it to, in essence, map their controls and investments into these 9 boxes to explain to their management where they're currently focused, how come they end up in those spots. And again, what I've found and what I've seen in my own experiences, particularly from the time that I was at Intel, and a lot of experiences with discussions with peers, is that most of the industry is focused in the semi-automated to manual detection and control space. Now, I'm a jaded person again, like I said, partly because of spending time in this industry and being in the tech sector and then being in the security industry itself. And I always wondered, why are we spending most of our time in semi-automated detection, manual detection and response? Well, the security industry profits from the insecurity of computing. And so when you think about that, if the industry itself profits from the insecurity, then the highest revenue and highest net income from the industry is going to be the highest cost to our organizations, which means when you look at this mix of risk and cost, the industry also likes to keep us in the semi-automated to manual detection and response. Why? Because it maximizes the industry revenue. And I think that's, again, economic incentives that we've got to shift and we've got to change by demanding more and demanding better and holding the industry more accountable, as well as holding ourselves more accountable to a control philosophy that I go shift left and shift down. Because when you think of what our organizations need, what society needs, they need us to have this constant focus on automation to reduce cost, a constant focus on prevention to reduce risk, because that's really the optimal spot for our organizations, because spending money on security doesn't increase the net income of your organization. It might for the security industry, but it doesn't increase it for yours. It's a net drain. And so when you think about this, again, you can't eliminate risk, as I said before. So gravity is always going to pull you to this upper right, just because you can't eliminate risk. But we have to constantly figure out what control failed. Why did it fail? How expensive is it? And continually drive ourselves towards automation as well as prevention, recognizing, again, gravity is going to pull you to the upper right. Now, the funny thing is, the first time I drew this, again, I worked for a security company. Some marketing folks said, hey, Malcolm, this looks great, and it totally makes sense, how you explain these things for ease of understanding for executives and business folks, let alone the security professionals, but we're going to redraw this. And I said, why? And they're like, well, that upper right quadrant's the magic quadrant, which I find, the whole fallacy in this whole thing. I go, I'm not, and I've never redrawn it, but psychologically, that's why, the quote unquote the magic quadrant's the upper right. But again, that's not the magic quadrant for us as practitioners. That might be the magic quadrant for the security industry, who makes more money when we're stuck there. But our magic quadrant and what our shareholders, what society needs from us is, again, more automated control approaches and things that push us into this green area more and more and more. Go on to the next one. Now, one of the things about leadership is leaders can distinguish motion from progress. Staying in semi-automated to manual detection and response space like we have for a few decades, it is an industry in motion. And again, progress is shifting left and shifting down and getting into that lower left in a continual loop, a continuous improvement, both from a strategic perspective as well as a tactical perspective, so that we can understand, again, what controls failed, how did they fail, and how do we do a better job on it. Now, the other thing about controls is controls are drag coefficient. They slow down people, data, business processes. They chew up unnecessary compute cycles. And so that's a notion that I call control friction. And friction has, is not an immutable property. We can play with it. And it's interesting when in a high control friction environment, again, I'll simplify it. There's two things that can happen in organizations. If you're an organization that salutes and executes and just follows policies, and whatever mandates or dictates come from above, and you introduce a lot of control friction, and the organization follows it, you're going to be slowing down the business. You're going to be slowing down time to market. You're going to create a different type of systemic business risk, one that'll add cost, one that will slow down innovation and slow down business processes. And in that situation, over the long haul, that creates a systemic business risk that could jeopardize the entirety of the business. Now, I think most organizations might do that temporarily, but certainly I grew up in the tech industry, and if you slowed things down too much or got in the way too frequently of people needing to do their jobs and execute with a level of velocity, people go around the control. And if people go around the control, then you've got unmanaged, unmitigated, unseen risk. You think you've put in a control that has managed to mitigate the risk, only to see perhaps down the road the risk pop up because end users and business went around the control. So we have to think of this 9 box actually as a 27 box. I just can't draw that great because there's this third dimension of control friction, and we've got to drive the industry to lower the friction that controls have on our business, and we also have to be accountable for the controls we deploy to evaluate that friction and see if it's going to be untenable from a business perspective. And that's a tough thing to do because by and large, it's not something I think a lot of our organizations focus on. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't say, hell no, this isn't going to happen. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't sometimes put things that have a high degree of friction in place to manage and mitigate risk, but we've got to routinely step back and go, is that still the right control, or is there a better way to do it to reduce the friction, improve the business velocity, and add more value to the company? And I think if we do this and think of these three dimensions and hold ourselves accountable to risk, total cost, and control friction, we'll end up in a stronger leadership space. We'll end up in a stronger position to be able to have influence in the business because we'll be talking to the business about the business outcomes they want. A CEO and a board and shareholders don't want a high risk, high cost, high control friction environment. They want as least amount of total cost as possible. They want the best risk portfolio as possible, and they want the least amount of control friction. And that's what we got to drive towards, recognizing it's a journey without a finish line, and we have to continue to move towards that, though. I've already mentioned this. It's the only way to enhance, in my view, trust in technology. And if for anybody who has read or seen or looked at the World Economic Forum stuff, it just kicked off in Davos over the weekend. And if you look back for the past several years, the World Economic Forum risk report, which I've just glanced at yesterday briefly for 2019, but for the past several years, in the top 5 risks for the world, along with income disparity, climate change, polarizations that are occurring politically, and aging populations, cyber risk is in the top 5 risks in the world. It has become a societal risk. That's why in my second edition of my book, I wrote an entire chapter around thinking about information risk as a corporate social responsibility. We have a moral and ethical obligation to solve the problem beyond just a fiduciary one. And if we don't do that, it alters the potential technology benefits that we might get out in the future. Go on to the next slide, Tim. And we have to do this so we can make tomorrow better than today. Tim had mentioned earlier that I've done work with Congress and Senate. I was at the Federal Trade Commission giving testimony to public hearing just a few weeks ago in December. But I had given Senate testimony at the Commerce and Science and Technology Committee almost 2 years ago on a hearing called The Promise and Perils of Emerging Technology. My opening statements were a story that I told. Some have probably heard me say this before, but I'll share it for those that haven't. There was a gentleman back a few years ago in the Midwest who had lost his eyesight in his going into his 40s. And in 2015, it had this experimental eye surgery that the FDA had approved in 2013. And the thought was, with the right technology, you could perhaps cure blindness. And this 56-year-old gentleman at the time had lost his eyesight for a good dozen years, give or take a little bit. And it was because of a degenerative eye disease. And the surgery was basically a souped up set of sunglasses with a camera, video processing unit, graphics processing unit, camera, basically plugged into the person's brain. And the hope and the thought was that we'd be able to give that gentleman his eyesight back by basically using a compute device to send electrical stimulation into his brain. He had the surgery in July of 2015. 90 days afterwards, give or take a little bit, it was in September 2015, he had asked his wife to take him outside because there was going to be a big harvest moon, and he wanted to see if he could see the moon for the first time in a number of years. So his wife walked him outside, and he looked up to the sky, couldn't see the moon, even though it was a big harvest moon, because of the contrast of light and dark and a few things, and his brain hadn't tuned in to the electrical signals enough. But what was compelling and startling was a story that he told and was shared in Time magazine shortly afterwards, was when his wife turned him around to walk him back into the house, the backlighting from the house, from the porch lights and the patio door lighting and that ambient light, had shone out enough that when he looked down at his wife, he was able to see images of her face for the first time in almost a dozen years. And I go, you know what? That's the hope and the promise of technology to connect and enrich lives. That's something that it's amazing. And that's what we get to make better for tomorrow. But imagine that, in essence, visor and future perhaps bionic eye, poorly designed, developed, and implemented, and has the ability to execute malicious code. Imagine a QR code in front of it, and that QR code is able to flip bits a wrong way and hold that gentleman or some future individual hostage to paying Bitcoin to get their eyesight back. Think of the ransomware attack on an individual because we did a crappy job of designing and implementing and mitigating the risk of that technology. That's where, you know, my view of our job, our focus, our mission, our purpose is protecting to enable. It's protecting to enable people, data, and business processes. It's creating those opportunities, that promise of hope in the future. That's what our leadership challenge is, while continuing to manage and mitigate risk. So again, getting back to the question, what is leadership? Leadership is the art of mobilizing others to want to struggle for shared aspirations. We've got to get our teams, our organizations, the industry to want to struggle to figure out how to prevent the compromise, not just accept that it's going to occur. We've got to want to struggle for the hope and the promise of what technology can do to help society create economic benefit, give that person their eyesight back, or, you know, a dialogue that I've had a number of times, and we've all started seeing the evolution of autonomous vehicles. You know, I saw my parents as they aged lose mobility, lose, in essence, the scope of their world because they weren't able to drive anymore. And I certainly hope by the time I get well into my 80s and I'm not perhaps capable of driving, that I can get into an autonomous car and go to the grocery store, go to a doctor's appointment, go see a grandkid's, you know, game, and have that freedom of mobility versus the confinement when you can't do those things. And I want to be able to trust that I can get into that car and be safe. And I think and I hope that all of us want that technology future that will create those opportunities. But the only way we'll have that is if we can do a far better job of managing and mitigating the risk than what we're seeing today. Again, it goes back to finding your purpose. I found mine not out of design, not out of anything other than, frankly, dumb luck. I wasn't setting out to be a security person. I wasn't setting out to manage information risk. I tripped into this and found a sense of purpose and passion after 9/11, after Code Red and IMDA in the summer fall of 2001, when Intel's chief information officer asked me to run security and business continuity. And it wasn't because I knew much about security. It's because I had the business acumen to understand what needed to be done and how it needed to be done. And I had a deep bench of technical strength that was able to teach me, and I was able to teach them. And I stayed curious. And I look for the hope in what we can do and what we can achieve. I don't cling to a mistake just because I spent a long time making it, which I think we all have a tendency, unfortunately, to do. And again, I think if you have something to fight for, you have something to fight with. And I think we all have something to fight for when we look at our families, when we look at the future, when we look at our other obligations. And again, it's about taking care of others. Looking at our job and the morality of it. There was an ISSA study, The Life and Times of Cybersecurity Professionals, that was published a little over 2 years ago. Almost 40% of folks in our profession chose the profession because of the morality of it. I chose it because I was mission oriented, and somebody asked me to go help manage it, and that was over 18 years ago, and I've never left it because, again, I want to take care of others. I have that strong sense of passion and purpose and curiosity, but I do see the moral and ethical challenges we have, and I want to help us find paths to solve them. The interesting thing about leadership is this item says here, is the illusion that it occurred. I think we always think we're leading when sometimes we're not. Again, we're clinging to a mistake because we spent a lot of time making it. And again, getting back to that, leadership is the art of motivating others to struggle for shared aspirations. Are we doing that? Are we staying in motion as we have for the past couple of decades, or are we challenging ourselves, our industries, our suppliers to make real progress and make sustained progress? Again, logic leads to reason. In a technical setting, that makes a bunch of sense, but we've got to create that emotional connection to these things, and that will lead to action. I used to teach strategic thinking when I was at Intel, and you can see the list of things here. That's the expertise behind the strategic models and the tools. Again, that ability to create a vision and the acumen and comprehending the whole picture, but that's it's the missing ingredient is the emotional connection. That's the activating ingredient. If I like to bake. If you think of baking bread, the strategic thinkers have the flour and the eggs and the sugar and whatever else to create the bread, but yeast is that activating ingredient. And if you think of creating that emotional connection, that sense of purpose, that will be an activating ingredient to make that strategy real. My perspective in a potential future leadership book that I've been mulling on for a couple of years is around curating commitment and how to do that. It starts with why. Again, that sense of purpose. Why are you here? Why do you care? Why does the security team exist? Got to make it personal. Again, getting into the storytelling, keeping it genuine. I've already mentioned, that emotional commitment is the yeast for that recipe for success in the space. Again, to simplify strategic thinking, it's your ability to sense, interpret, and take action. We've got the same thing on the security side, but CEOs, business unit general managers, they've got a bunch of unmanaged, uncontrollable things they're dealing with too, but their ability to sense and interpret and take action is really what makes a great business leader at that executive level, at that CEO level, at the business unit GM. We've got to do that, but again, there's the other element to it here on the next slide. And this is making that strategy real. It's getting to commitment. I trademarked these 6 words back a couple years ago because I started using them a lot. And when I first left Intel, I was getting asked a lot of questions: is why did you leave? Why silence? Why now? You know, why did you stay at Intel so long? All these why questions. And I've always had a simple view of choosing a company manager to work for, an organization to be a part of. And what I've come to believe in terms of a leadership philosophy is that if we can create an environment for our employees where they can routinely say to themselves, I believe in the mission, I believe in the management, I believe in myself, I believe in my peers, they feel like they belong because somebody gives a shit about them, frankly. And the work they do and the work the broader organization does matter, the rest is relatively easy because people will feel committed to what they're doing and why they're doing it. And so I've always tried to cultivate an organizational set of values and work environment where the employees that I work with routinely can feel, I believe, I belong, I matter. I've always found I've hit my career ideal state and just been in the perfect stride when I can feel these things. And I've seen that in the teams that I've managed as well. But even more broadly across the organization we're trying to influence, if they can understand what we're believing and why we believe it, they feel like they belong as a part of helping the security mission, and they can see that it will matter now as well as in the future. We'll have, again, a stronger sense of mission and purpose, and we'll be able to create a stronger connection towards achieving the goals that we have as an organization running risk and security. You know, a lot of companies, they have these, what I'll say, slogans. We got to be bold, think big, act faster. Those are kind of interesting. I don't really like them. I think when you're being bold, you're risking others. I don't necessarily know what think big means, and act faster, and you guys will see this in the Formula One analogies throughout the PDA. Speed kills. So acting faster sometimes may not be really what we need. Instead, we need a few other things. We need to be brave. Being brave means you're risking yourself, not risking others. And sometimes the security team needs to do that and stand up and say, hell no, not happening on my watch. And be brave on that. Sometimes we've got to take the perspective of the customers and society, not just the shareholders. We got to think exponentially. We know that computing has been growing exponentially for decades, Moore's law. But we've been approaching the risk linearly. Hence, if you were to draw an exponential line of compute power and compute capability and drew a linear line of controls, hence we got a risk gap. Again, we've got to do transformational things, not just incrementalism on our controls to create a bend in the risk. And then we've got to act with purpose. We got to know why we exist. You know, when I was back at Intel, when I first got into this space, the mission of the security team was safeguard information assets, blah, 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 bullshit statement that I frankly can't remember. And after a few years, I kind of had this epiphany that, again, we simplified the mission, protect to enable. Because if we weren't protecting to enable people, data, and business, we were getting in the way. We were wasting money. And again, it's all about protecting to enable the people, the data, and the business. And once we have that mission clarity, that purpose clarity, it allowed us to have a better connection to the business. It allowed the business to have a better connection to us. And I think it put us in a better spot of influence. That's also why I left Intel and moved to Cylance and became Chief Security and Trust Officer there, because I had a stronger sense of I believe I belong and I matter, and I had a stronger view that I could help more broadly not only protect Cylance's organization, but protect society, because I was tired of the state of the industry itself. So, summary of my lessons over the years, 9 box controls. Again, leaders can distinguish motion from progress. Really think about what you're doing, and if they're just measurements of motion or you've made real progress. Don't get caught in the illusion of leadership. Be clear on what you believe. And if it's not protect to enable, find what you think your purpose is, what your security team's mission is, and make sure that it's connected not only to the broader organizational mission, but again, recognize and think about the societal risks that might occur if you don't properly manage and mitigate the risk. With that, I've gone on for, I don't know, 40 minutes, give or take a little bit. Tim, I'll turn it back to you, but happy to answer and comment to any Q&A or perspectives people want to share.
Thanks so much, Malcolm. Always appreciate your perspective and drawing connection between both your technical skills and capability as a CISO, and then driving home the fact that it is all about people in the end. And there are a couple questions that have come in, and I'll bring up Dave's question first. Dave, thanks for chatting in the question. Dave says here, Malcolm, not everyone can become a strategic leader overnight. Are there small steps that you can recommend to help people who have been in management roles to start to become leaders?
Yeah, great question, and I agree with you. It's a transformation that we all need to do. I think all of you participating in the Professional Development Academy is one step along it. But even when I talk to recent college grads who've come into organizations and they talk about wanting to move their career up over time, and they're 20-something years old, and I'd say, where do you want to be when you're 50? What do you want to do? What do you want your life to look like? Start thinking out into the future about those things, and start again thinking about again the values, the beliefs, the hope and opportunity, not only for yourself, but again more broadly for the business. Understanding the business that you're in, and contemplating what opportunities that business holds and the impact it can have for others. I think just getting to those basic things, if you start exercising that type of mental muscle, will help grow you. And on the other side of it, frankly, I'll be really blunt. There's a bunch of shitty managers and leaders that I've worked for in the past. And when you work for somebody that you don't believe in, that doesn't create an organization that you feel like you belong, and they don't make you feel like you matter, learn from them. Learn from them how to not be that asshole, frankly, and then figure out from there. That's a great way to also learn, is to look at crappy leaders and learn how you don't want to become them.
Yeah, good point, Malcolm. We have another question from Banu. And Banu, thanks for noting the question. If anyone else has questions, feel free to type them in to the text box. We've got a couple of them here. Banu asks, Malcolm, what are some of the metrics that you can use to measure the maturity of an InfoSec organization?
What I've started doing, there's a bunch of metrics, right, that you'll find. SANS has some, Gartner has some, Forrester has them, and you go patching, training, how many events you've had, all those type of metrics. Now, a lot of those metrics, again, I think demonstrate a point in time thing, and they get us stuck in this sense of motion, right, versus progress. I think sometimes we need to change the nature of the measurements. If you go to my 9 box of controls, you could map your spending, you could map your resources into those 9 boxes and say, how much friction are we creating? How much are we impeding the business velocity? How much of our effort and our time are in semi-automated to manual detection response? Just doing that type of mental mapping could also be a great way to demonstrate where you're at in relative maturity. There's certainly a bunch of maturity models that are out there, and they're useful, and I've used them. You know, NIST has some, the Department of Energy has some. You know, there's the CMMI stuff that you can create kind of on your own, and those are useful. But I also think that they sometimes mask the real issue. I was having this dialogue with a former Intel employee who works for a large construction company now, and was just asked to go run security. And him and I knew each other for a long time, so he called me up and wanted me to mentor him and stuff. So we started doing that. It turns out it's actually also led to some potential, potential customer for Silence. Not that that's relevant, but the dialogue him and I had, because he was starting to use a maturity model, and by and large, guess what? All the assessments done by the external things said they're on a 1 to 5 basis, they're about 3.5. And yet they're still reacting and responding and have all these problems. I said, well, a lot of people would say that's a good maturity. I said, but the reality is, if you're still getting popped left and right and you're playing whack-a-mole with malicious code, you're not very mature as an organization, because you're still in motion versus progress. I go, let's flip it around and let's do a compromise assessment and figure out where you have existing compromise that you're not aware of. Let's figure out what controls failed, why they failed, and then go up level and do something transformational. That will then move the needle, and then from there you can then reset a baseline of maturity, because you've created a step function increase in where you're at. So I think, again, the maturity models can kind of reinforce staying where you're at, because people go, well, 3.5 out of 5, you never achieve a 5, so that's pretty good. In which case, we continue to have the current status quo. Sorry for the long-winded answer, but hopefully that gives you some ideas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Malcolm. Another question from Gregory came in. He notes here that we live in a time of instant gratification, and that becoming a leader is often a long process that's not just long, but also takes a lot of hard work. And he asks, Malcolm, what is the key to being resilient and keeping your focus on getting better and better and better, bettering yourself as well as the organization in which you work within over time?
It's a great question, and I don't know that I have a perfect answer for it, because I think we all struggle with it at times. I mean, I struggle with it, and I feel defeated at times, and you kind of get stuck in the muck. But I then step back and I go, I think about it and I go, success. The only place where success comes before work is in the dictionary. I mean, think about it. It's always going to require work, and sometimes we feel overwhelmed and inundated and just tired, and we've got to get past that. We've got to again struggle ourselves. That leadership is the art of motivating others to struggle for shared aspirations. We've got to lead ourselves. We've got to struggle as well with this. And I also believe that strength comes through struggle. And much like, I work out Tim knows this, and anybody who knows me, I'm a gym rat. I'm up at 4:15 almost every morning, at the gym at 4:30. I don't necessarily want to do that, but I do it every day, 7 days a week. And it's a constant thing. So it's a journey with no finish line, just like life is. And, and hard work beats talent that doesn't work so hard. So when you find that you get in that spot, again, try and go back and figure out what you believe in, what motivates you. and find a way to continue to move forward. Because if you don't, you won't be able to lead your organizations forward. And sometimes when you've lost the faith, again, this is also being vulnerable. I've told my teams when I've been in that spot, and guess what? Sometimes they help me because they provided in me the belief and the motivation and the meaning to move forward.
Yeah, thanks, Malcolm. One more question here, and we'll wrap up this webinar. And the question, Malcolm, is, what's been your greatest challenge of being a security leader with a business background? And part of that question was raised with an additional follow-on, and it is relative to, you've changed industries to some extent. You focused on something relative to business and finance, and you found yourself, because of opportunities in the security area. So what's been the greatest challenge of being a security leader with a business background?
The lack of technical acumen. I certainly understand the technology at an architectural level and stuff like that, but I've never been a hands-on keyboard technologist. Last time I wrote code was in Fortran in the late 80s. So that's a constant area where I struggle. And I have to rely on my team. I have to continue to grow my acumen. And let's just say, growing up in a technology company like Intel, that could be challenging. I work for a lot of deep technologists. And just like at Silence, my CEO still deconstructs malicious code. So you get a CEO of a security company who is a former hacker and deep technologist. He will tear apart malicious code for fun and just for his own growth and knowledge. I can't do that. So how do I end up in a technical debate with them? Well, I can only get so far, and then I have my own team that have more technical prowess than me. When we end up in a opposing view on how to control for risk internally on a technical level, I have to rely on others. And so the way in which it's a risk, right? So I have to look at it, how do I manage and mitigate it? I manage and mitigate it through the best way I know how, continue to learn, as well as rely on others. And if your weakness is business acumen, grow that skill, but recognize you may not be able to fully grow it just because you don't have that academic background, you don't have the practice, in which case you're going to have to find a finance person, an accountant, a marketing person, a business strategist to help you. But that's true of, if you think of your role as basically you're the CEO of a captive enterprise called InfoSec. CEOs don't know everything about finance. They don't know everything about marketing. They don't know everything about everything. They're good general managers that have strategic insights and can make good decisions. And so if you think of it in that fashion, it'll help you think about the approach to the business acumen you might need to grow in, just like I've had to think about the approach to filling my technical acumen gap.
Yeah, thanks so much, Malcolm. We're getting a lot of thank yous and appreciation for your time and for sharing this level of detail, both on the technical side of being a security officer and an executive within an organization, but then also relative to your leadership perspective and insights. Because as you noted throughout this presentation, Malcolm, it is all about the people. And I've heard you say on a number of occasions, as have others within the Professional Development Academy, when it comes to a security perspective, people are the perimeter, and the way in which you connect with people helps to drive the possibility of what is possible and what it is that can be created because of the connections that you have with other individuals. And so, Malcolm, on behalf of everyone who's tuned in today, I wanted to thank you for your time and for your insights relative to sharing those insights for this webinar and for everyone participating. For those participating, just as a heads up, as mentioned before, we will have these on a regular basis. Next month, on February 25th, Courtney Holliday will be joining us, and she is responsible for the Leadership Institute at MD Anderson Cancer Center. in Texas. And so we hope that you'll all be able to join us when Courtney provides her executive insights on leadership. And if anyone from your team or yourself specifically are interested, just know that enrollment is now open for the next Professional Development Academy programs. We've got programs in high performance leadership as well as enterprise cybersecurity leadership. And the next start date for both of those 12-week programs is in April. Feel free to email us at moderator@pdaleadership.com for any information about that. And relative to Courtney Holiday for next month in February, Alicia has just messaged out to everyone via the chat box here the link that you could put on your calendar and mark that now for February 25th. It will be at the same time as we are meeting right now. So hope everyone has a wonderful day. And again, Malcolm, thank you so much for your time and your insights. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Enjoy the week, and good leadership to you.